So, Ruthie, shall we look at some photos?
Yeah.
All right.
But I might bring the tripod.
Yeah.
Can you do another one of those?
Yes. Do you want me?
Yeah.
Da-da-da-da-dum. Da.
Both my parents came from different parts of Russia. They met at some political meetings. Maybe it was, I don't know if they fell in love. I don't know what, I think my father always fancied himself as this sort of handsome little man. I think he was actually, from photographs, tiny but very handsome. This is my father, still in Bessarabia, with his very close friend Joseph Yosef Kushnir. And this is my mother, and I think her sister. It was about 1914. That's a very nice photo, actually. Mm-hmm. So my mother would have been about 10 or 12 there. And this is a sort of a later photo of my mother. She hasn't got white hair yet. She's probably about 16, 17 there. And this is a photograph of my father, probably in the 1920s. They got married in Palestine. They lived in Jerusalem. And there are photographs from that time. And there are also photographs of my father sort of digging in the earth and being a bit of a chalutz, a sort of pioneer. But he was very, very involved in politics and in the kibbutz movement, left-wing Zionism, all sorts of discussions, research documents here, there, the other. These are my parents being pioneers, digging and building, but these are rather faint photos. But anyway, I think it's rather funny thinking of my father doing physical work. These are pictures of my mother on the boat to Palestine in around 1926-27, and sitting on the boat, being very jolly. I just think they're lovely photos. I think that's great. So what then happened, I think, was that my father was sent or decided to go to Germany to resume his studies, but also to do political work, helping get Jews out of Germany. So this was in the late 20s, early 30s. They lived in Berlin for a while, but in 1933, probably, when Hitler came to power, people said it wasn't safe for my father, and they came to England. My understanding is that actually during the 1930s, when he was here in England, he helped fund the Jewish terrorists, the Irgun. He laundered money for them. That's what my brother says. So he funded the Jewish resistance, the sort of terrorist resistance to the British Mandate, where when they're blowing up the King David Hotel, things like that. That's the myth, whether it's true or not. When war broke out, they were enemy aliens and had to register every week with the police until Russia joined the war in 1940. My mother was evacuated to Cambridge with my brother. My father stayed in London and did his bit of sort of fire watching. I obviously got conceived somehow on some visit that my father might have made to Cambridge in a break from his night warden duties, and I was born in somewhere called Queen Elizabeth Square in a nursing home in Cambridge in 1943.
Right, a nice fresh salad. Out.
Immediately post-war, we had rationing, because rationing went on until the 50s. We bought herring out of barrels, salt herring out of barrels, olives. Our breakfasts were always herring, olives, white cheese, Hovis bread, spring onions, knobbel, garlic. You know, it was kibbutz breakfast. Salami. And a kosher butcher. Every Friday we had a boiling chicken with the neck and the feet, and I knew how to take the scales off the thing, and there were all these little baby eggs in the chicken that went in. So I knew how to make chicken soup from a very early age. Apparently I was a model child until I was 9. When I was 9, and I was due to have my 9th birthday, my parents said to me, "Would you like a watch or a bicycle?" So of course I said a bicycle, but they gave me a watch, which I've still got, though it doesn't work. That's what they were like. That's what they were like. I think that the whole thing of me going to Jewish camp and things like that came up. My father was the head of Mapam, which had a youth wing, which was called Hashomer HaTzair, the Young Guard. It was a bit like Chinese Cultural Revolution type language. Anyway, so I'd sussed myself that it would be impossible for me to go to Hashomer HaTzair, which was much more left-wing, because my dad was sort of the figurehead of the organisation, so no one would treat me normally if I went there, really. So I went to Habonim, the builders, which was much more middle of the road. It was still socialist, but not as left-wing. And so I started going to Habonim meetings. They had a building in Finchley Road, and started going to Habonim camps. And, became indoctrinated as a Zionist. So this is my brother as a little boy in 1936. My father looks completely mad there. I was like an only child because by the time I was 8, my brother had left home, and before that, he was mainly up in his attic studying and at school. He wasn't a boarder, but he was really focused on studying. When I was 14 maybe, and my brother was 24, they sent me, I went to Israel for the summer, and my brother was basically in charge of me, and that's when I got to know him, and we had a fantastic time together. So part of that summer, I also went and stayed on a fantastic kibbutz, my father's movement's kibbutz, which was a much more strict kibbutz, where the children didn't live with their parents at all. They lived in children's houses. So as a teenager, it was fantastic. I was living with all these young people, boys and girls, in children's houses. We were out in the fields every day because it was the summer, picking oranges. I got brown as a berry, incredibly fit, made great friends, and I didn't want to come back. My father, I think this is a wonderful photograph of my father being an orator, because he was a great public speaker. I think this is the most wonderful photo.
The reality is that the person I really loved was my father. I absolutely idolised and adored my father. And it was a great shock that he was the one who died first, and I was then left with my mother, who I knew I had to take on and be part of my life. That wasn't what I wanted. The person I absolutely venerated and adored was my father, even though he expressed great disappointment in my politics.
What it was like being a teenager. I had this, it was very schizoid in a way, or split three ways. I had this very foreign, very un-English home, where English was rarely spoken, that was very focused on my dad and Mr. Big Zionist and important meetings and having to be quiet and routine. The household was very, very routinized. Then there was Habonim as a teenager, which was co-educational, which was highly creative, which was from all over the UK. So I would both go every week to meetings up in Finchley Road. Every Saturday or Sunday we would have meetings in your pluga, in your group, and it was your age set. Then we would have camps. We would have summer camp, we would have winter and Easter activity, which would again be residential. And it was a real antidote to the third part, which was going to a very straight up and down, very, very academically focused girls' school, in which there was a Jewish quota, because 30% of us, were Jews, because it was Hampstead, North West London, and all these clever Jewish immigrants. We all got scholarships. So a third of us, because we had Jewish prayers, but we were in this very Jewish and very English environment. We were made into young English ladies. They had an intake of working class girls, 2 or 3, who came in with the 11 plus, with the scholarship, and left at 15. 2 or 3. Diana Philpott was one who was very challenging. She already had sex, I think, by the time she was 15 or 16. Oh, unheard of. Anyway, so that was my life was, I survived the school because I had this wonderful social life. I would go off to Habonim camp and come back, and I'd be dirty, and I'd go and have a bath, and my mother, and I'd be 14, or my mother come in and sort of scrub me and be very physically intimate. Now I found that, I think that was very deeply imprinted itself. That was one thing. So the whole thing about intrusion onto my body wasn't sexual abuse, nothing like that at all. It was just that she didn't give me physical space. But that was combined in telling me nothing about what it was like, sex or anything like that. But it was like she owned me. I got some sort of scholarship from some Jewish organisation, and I was going for 6 weeks to do anthropological field work in a moshav, which is not like a kibbutz, but they own their houses and land individually, the people there, but they market collectively. And it was part of the whole network of ways of absorbing immigrants and also reclaiming land. And I was looking for a situation, a village, where there were Jews who had been in the camps and came from Germany or Eastern Europe, who were living with Jews who'd come from North Africa, because I was very, very interested in race relations and diversity, even then. I did this thesis, but in the process, I became really aware that the Jewish agency was run by Jews from Western Europe, the Russians and the Germans, that the teachers were Yemenite, and that really the Arabs who were there were completely invisible. So at the bottom of the pile there were the Arabs, who would be doing labouring and were around, but you never saw them. In a way, they were invisible. Then you'd have the Jews who worked
within the system of the Jewish agency and the state, like the Yemenite teachers, and they were lower down. Then you had the people who ran the Jewish agency and the whole state apparatus, who were predominantly German, Russian, Polish. And then you had the Jews in the 50s, who fairly recently, because I was doing this in 1963, in the 50s had come from various Arab countries, from North Africa, from Tunisia, from Algeria and Morocco. And they were also bottomish of the pile. And I realised Israel was a very stratified and racist society, and I was appalled. It was convenient for my father to blame Tom for my, deconversion from Zionism, because the time frame was relatively close, but I'd made that decision before I met Tom. And I'd met an Israeli au pair girl that my mother had. Her name was Yosefa. She also told me about this guy, Tom Kay, who had been her boyfriend in Israel. He was an architect. And I came down after, it was probably in May, June. And I remember my dad took me to hear the Beat Poets and Allen Ginsberg and those people in the Albert Hall. Anyway, it was a Friday evening, and Yosefa said that Tom Kay was going to come. Come Friday night, and this little pipsqueak turns up, Tom Kay, who I thought was probably quite attractive. And Yosefa was, he was so good. He was, how charming he was, Tom, and he was very nice to my parents. And then Friday night, and he turned up, and immediately we had an argument about the Beat Poets. I remember that. Anyway, so we made other arrangements to go out, and we went to hear Bernice Rubens's brother, who was a violinist, went to a concert in Wigmore Hall, and I knew. And then we went to a Chinese restaurant with a fantastic group of people, actually. And I knew that that would be the night. Yeah, anyway. So we started going out together. I had a boyfriend in Bristol, but he was he was a bonking boyfriend, really. He wasn't really someone but, nice guy. And so I remember this one Saturday morning, and he'd gone, this guy, and there was this knock at the door, and there was Tom. He'd driven down from London in his Morgan. So that became a pattern, and so I got rid of Mr. Bonking, and so we got together. It's not bad, actually. I suppose if you go slow, it's so interesting, actually. Now people look at Tom's photos and say, what a nice looking guy, because I don't see it.
No, still?
Well, I suppose it's like I'm so used to him. I'm really used to him, so, I don't see it. But I must have found him attractive at one stage, wasn't I? I suppose. Anyway, that's a fair discussion, really.
So where did that term come from?
Fet is my mum. It's what I use to say this is what my mum would have said when it's not. Something isn't appropriate, or, not in front of the children, or, you say fet. Not nice. Tom had a job in Australia. Well, the first time he went, he cashed in his first class travel so that we could stop off in the States. We maybe had a week in New York before Tom went off to Australia for 2 weeks maybe, and I stayed on in New York. When I was there, I was researching for my thesis, for my planning degree,
And I decided my subject was participation, community participation in planning decisions. And in the States, they had a movement which was called advocacy planning, which didn't exist in the UK, whereby progressive architects and planners took cases on behalf of communities that would challenge roads going through poor areas or bad planning decisions. So when we came back, we became very, very interested in tremendous wastage of resources. There were lots and lots of council houses that had been acquired, but then they were lying empty, and there was a great problem of homelessness. That was actually the period when shelter was also starting. We decided we'd form a group called Camden Housing Action that would actually address this issue of empty houses and homeless families. And we actually, through that group, got licensed squatting started in Camden, and we worked with groups that were over in Notting Hill that were also doing that sort of thing. And we also started there was only one law centre nationally in Notting Hill at that stage, and we got 2 law centres started in Camden and did a lot of campaigning work. I had always assumed we would have children. I assumed I would get married, and I assumed that we would have children. That was before the women's movement. And so I didn't question that that was my destiny. As a mother, I was probably quite good on the practical front, food and washing and keeping them, doctors and things like that. I was always trying to find time to read. And so there are pictures of, when we're on holiday and things where Tom would be playing with them and I'd be sitting and reading. So I was always slightly distancing myself. But I think it was lovely. They were delicious. But they did fight. I don't know how I was as a mother. I was probably quite a good mother, but I also probably was quite volatile and could lose my temper. Well, that's nice. Yes. Lovely. Well, he was just really, really amazing. Yes, but he was just the most, charming. He really was an incredibly engaging, captivating, sort of charming person. I would say that that's a 6-year-old attempt, but it's quite nice to do it. But as you can see, I'm no great artist. Though, that is my self-portrait, which I did after having done the course. That was my first one underneath. When the course started, we had to do a self-portrait, and then at the end of the course we had to do it. So that is a difference, isn't it? A big change happened in 1980. Tom went through periods of being quite depressed, and when he had the motorbike accident in 1980, that was a very big thing because his career might have really taken off. He was, in the 70s, one of the sort of in amongst the top architects. He became someone who was damaged in a way, and he was quite depressed. So from then, in a sense, he was someone who was prone to depression. So it was also treading on eggshells a bit around him. And the only time when he really came out of himself and things, he really took off was when we went to the West Bank. And somehow he became completely fulfilled there and enormously productive. So that was for 20 years, in a sense.
he was in a sort of a bit of a no man's land as far as work and what he was doing and how he felt. And that really affected the relationship. At that time, which was sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, we both decided, Tom was thinking that he'd like to close the practice maybe and retire. I was working freelance and wasn't, I was doing interesting work, but, we both thought we'd like to take a year out and go somewhere else. And we were thinking about it. And then the Second Intifada broke and we got very involved in pro-Palestinian activities and we decided we'd go there for a year initially. And I think it was through becoming politicised there were various, there was one or two pro-Palestinian organisations. And we decided we would go there and see what we could do, or just observe. So Tom went, I think, in the autumn of 2001, maybe. And I followed in 2002. And that was at the height of the Second Intifada. So that's why we went. We'd been involved in local politics and community politics, and then probably not in much during the 90s, really that much. But it had always been there, and I suppose both of us were anti-Zionist, and it crystallised for us, and we really felt very passionately, both of us, about it, separately and together. And then when he was diagnosed with cancer, I really was determined that I would focus on that, because I hadn't really prioritised him after his motorbike accident, because it was very busy and I was working full time and the children. And so and that was a very, very good time, actually, that last 18 months, 2 years, where it was very tender and very affectionate, and I feel very happy about that. I feel it was very good for him, So I think that the last sort of, the last few years together were very good, actually.
I think since Tom died, I've done okay. The first 2 or 3 years, I was going backwards and forwards to the West Bank quite a lot, well, a lot more. I mean, I suppose I go twice a year now, but not for long periods of time. So I'm going in the beginning of May for about 9 days, and I suppose I'll go again in the autumn. Because maintaining those links are very important. And I haven't really suffered from loneliness, but I haven't allowed myself to be lonely, I suppose, or I'm quite happy spending time on my own, but I do go out and about quite a lot. That's lovely. Look. Well, it is a wonderfully formal English garden. But it's still quite, I think the thing that I really miss is not having a special relationship. But I haven't found anyone that I'd really like to have a special relationship with.
Do you feel like you're looking?
Well, no, I mean, people presented themselves, a few people presented themselves, and either it wasn't it was too soon, or, it wasn't what I was looking for. And now I think with the cancer, I can't really look, it's not a sort of fair dues, really. I mean, I have a friend who's desperate to sort of get onto Soulmates, and, she tried actually recently, but I would I advertise myself, widowed with cancer, looking, I mean, what would one say? I think I didn't appreciate what we had sufficiently, or him, at the time. I'm very glad that we had that last period together, both in the West Bank and, when he was ill. And I'm really glad, I've said that before, the last sort of 6 or 7 years together were very good. And I didn't appreciate how much security it gave me that Tom was so committed to me, really. You know, and what you miss is someone who really, you know, you're really special for someone. That's what you can't replace. And I don't think I appreciated that enough, really. It's absolutely fabulous with the sun coming through.